Dr. Brand, who will be our speaker this morning and once again in the afternoon, is the professor of biology and paleontology in the Department of Earth and Biological Sciences at Loma Linda University. He received his PhD from Cornell University in 1970 and has been on the LLU faculty since then. He teaches courses in subjects I could never take, but we're very thankful: vertebrate biology, paleontology, and the philosophy of science. His research focuses on the processes of fossilization and the geological factors that influence preservation of fossils. He has published over 30 scientific research papers and numerous articles. He has published 3 books which have been translated into other languages, and his strongest long-term interest has been developing a Bible-centered approach to the integration of faith and science. I believe we're very honored to have Dr. Brand here, and if I remember correctly, just a few weeks ago, if anyone else receives the review, you would have seen a published article in the review just recently, and Dr. Brand was one of the authors there.
My topic and the one in the church service are related, very much related. We're why it matters. We'll be each talking about different aspects of the answer to this question. There's plenty of room for different perspectives here, different parts of the answer. We could take all week on this, but I'll be talking about certain parts of this question. We have choices to make. Now, most of us don't have much trouble making this choice, but the question is, which direction are we going? Have we been going this way, or are we going this way? Down to beer cans and Super Bowl. And that's our question here. How do we decide? And so it's something we need to think about and understand how to answer the questions that people have, and how to understand ourselves, what are the issues involved. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church has over the years done more than most groups. This is the only denomination that has put real money over the years into the study of creation and evolution, the scientific aspect of it, with the Geoscience Research Institute and the Department of Earth and Biological Sciences at Loma Linda. This has been our focus for, well, it was since before I was involved, since 1962 at least, for our department. And our church has had, for many years, had an annual conference, sort of a long weekend meeting somewhere, most years, usually meeting at some geologically interesting site, presenting papers, arguing about these things, discussing them, and learning from each other. And that was a marvelous benefit. Our church still does think that particular thing we call Briscoe doesn't happen now, but it's been replaced by another type of gathering, actually twice a year, with a committee that studies these issues. Okay, so we have these choices. We can put this another way: were we created in the way that the Bible describes, or did humans evolve? And it really comes down to, which we'll see here pretty quick, what's our source of authority? And is it the Bible, or is it what science has to say? And so here are our sources of authority. And it's a little more complicated because of the way it's being dealt with. Over here, this point of view that has life evolving, for some people, it still has the Bible sort of involved. And so they'll think, well, yeah, we are being biblical. But yet you notice where the Bible is here in this approach. It's kind of behind. It's not the source of authority. It's not that important. God is involved somehow. We refer to this as theistic evolution, the idea that God used evolution over millions of years as His means of creation. And the reason I'm comparing those here today is because this is becoming very prominent in Christian thinking. In that theistic evolution, life evolved over hundreds of millions of years. God was vaguely involved somehow, but not directly doing the creation. Whereas in our literal creation point of view, which many people think is very naive, but it takes the Bible seriously and recognizes that God, that humans and other forms were created by God in a literal creation week. Like I was saying, this is important because it is becoming, theistic evolution is becoming very widespread in the Christian community in general. It's rapidly going over to theistic evolution. Now, that doesn't mean that the people in the pews in the churches necessarily accept that, but their leaders do. The scholarly world and the theologians, I find, just have gone that way. They do that because they're convinced that science has demonstrated evolution over millions of years, and so they have to fit in somehow and reinterpret the Bible accordingly. And Elder Zinke will tell you some reasons why we don't interpret it that way. We're not willing to go that way. So I'm going to be talking about several things about what science has to tell us, and what new information we have pertinent to this. Okay, so like I say, choices are changing. So let's just talk for a minute. Why is it that we care about creation and evolution? And Elder Zinke will give you more of the answers of this, but just think about for a minute, why do we worship God? In Revelation 4:11, it gives us the answer, "You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power." Why? Before you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. Next. Psalm 103, "Know that the Lord, He is God. He is He who has made us, and not we ourselves. To whom then will you liken me? To whom shall I be equal?" says the Holy One. "Lift up your eyes on high and see." And here's the answer. See who has created these things. This is consistently the reason why God is worthy of our worship. For all the gods of the peoples are idols. And the people in Israel had trouble with this all the time. But the Lord made the heavens. Okay, the creator and the created. We are the created. God is the creator. Next. The Bible is our foundation. Next. And it isn't just Genesis versus the rest of the Bible. It's all through the Bible you find that the Bible writers and Jesus accepted the literal creation as being true. And just one little idea that is very helpful to me, Jesus and the Old Testament. Now think of Jesus' mission to this earth. He was to come here, live his life, and die and be resurrected, to live as we live, and show that accomplish various things, but one was to show that a person can indeed do that, live a holy life, and he could not have an advantage over us. If he had an advantage, he could not have accomplished his mission. He could not have his divine knowledge. He could not use his divine power, and yet he was to come here as a baby and face the devil, who's had thousands of years of experience in tricking people. How could we even think that will work? Well, God gave himself an advantage, a tremendous advantage that we can also have if we will take it. And that is, he had his servants write the book that he knew he'd be reading when he got here, the Old Testament. And this book had to be reliable, it had to be trustworthy, it had to be factual. It had to tell him how life was created and that he was the creator and who the enemy was. All these things he had to learn from that book. He could not get direct information in a way that we can't get it. And so that gives us, to me, an insight into a very important reason why we should trust the Old Testament. Next. Okay, what does the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, say about creation? It was a real event and an important one. Next. And it's a continual reminder. For all these thousands of years, the Sabbath is a reminder that God is a creator of the wonders we see all us around us, these fantastic creatures and these beautiful flowers, and the fruit that we eat, so delightful. And God is a creator of all these. So what does it take to make all these natural wonders? Next. Well, it takes the laws of chemistry and physics. And science will tell us that's all it is. That's what it does. That's what creates everything, the laws of chemistry and physics. And indeed, those laws are very important. Those are God's toolkit. He made the laws of chemistry and physics. Science tells us, though, that those laws will make everything. They will create everything. Next. So look at kind of an analogy here. Can those laws make an automobile? Do you just let the laws of chemistry and physics do their thing? Will they make an automobile? Next. By themselves, they won't even make a tricycle. Okay? But science will tell us, well, yeah, sure, not right away, but maybe if we wait. Maybe if we wait 100 million years, we'll see what happens. Okay, so here's what happens in 100 million years. Your toolkit, still has some remnants left, but you don't have an automobile. Next. What does it take? Besides the laws of nature, and those are indeed very important, those are God's toolkit, but it requires an engineer with a plan and a mechanism to put the plan into effect, arms and legs in a factory. Okay, it takes those things to make an automobile. So what does it take to make this? Well, you get the same situation. It takes the laws of nature, yeah, in more than wrenches, but it takes the laws of nature, but a divine engineer with a plan and a mechanism. In this case, the mechanism is divine power to put the plan into effect. I assume that you don't really want to sit here for a week. So I have selected just a few things to talk about, but it's a very amazing big topic that we could cover if we had the time. But here you have the presumed evolutionary tree. And so you have all these organisms, if there was not a creator, they all had to evolve from simple beginnings, bacteria and protozoa, and so you have all these different creatures. Now, when we look at the fossils, okay, the fossils are the only evidence that gives us a history book, actual evidence from the past. And the question is, do we find evidence in the fossils that for the evolution of all these creatures? Well, here in the Grand Canyon, this is the part of the stack of rocks we call a geologic column. It's like a history book. They were laid down one layer at a time, one above the other, so they really do give a history in a sense. This is the lower third of that geologic column. Here in the bottom we have rocks that have basically no fossils. Okay, so that maybe that was what was here at creation, beginning at the end of creation. Now here are what we call the lowest Cambrian rocks, the first sedimentary rocks that have fossils. And you've probably heard of the Cambrian explosion. That's referring to the fact that all of a sudden, here in these first rocks, and I would say these are the first rocks laid down in the flood, you now have representatives of all the different phyla of organisms. All of a sudden, bam, there they are. So, and below that there's no data, so they all appear, and where's the evidence that they have evolved from common ancestors? Well, it isn't there. It comes from conjecture and guesses and theory and assumptions. And I want to comment on this little guy here. This is the color is just a guess, but here's one of the early Cambrian trilobites, one of the first creatures found in this Cambrian explosion. Okay, is a trilobite a simple, crude creature? No, not at all. It's very complex. It's as complex as anything living today of its type. And if we could look at its cells, at each cell in its body, we have untold billions of them in our bodies. They have as well. And every cell in this creature's body was the same as ours. And there's good evidence that would tell us that. It had to have been that way. And so, if all of a sudden right here at the beginning, the first things buried in the flood were as complex in their biochemistry as we are, then where did this come from? Well, the idea that it didn't come from God is just a guess. It's a theory, but there's no data to indicate that that would be true. So that's a problem for the theory. We all start with some assumptions that we make on faith. Now we have evidence for the existence of God, but we can never prove it, and so there is faith that is necessary. if one believes there is no God, what's your evidence for that? Everybody starts with an assumption that is based on faith. And, and so we start with these assumptions, but our assumption is supported by the Bible, is supported by all kinds of things. But now we're going to look at this question, is there new evidence that's giving support to evolution? We find in recent years the confidence of scientists in evolution seems to be becoming much stronger. Is that because there's new evidence? Or is it for some other reason? That's what I want to look at here mostly in the next little while. And there have been advances in understanding life, advances in molecular biology. When Darwin developed his theory, nobody had a clue what made something alive. It was thought that a living cell, was a little bag with some fluid and some things floating in it. That's all was known. They knew nothing about molecular biology. But now we are in a different era. In the last few years, there have been new ways to analyze DNA that have just released amazing amounts of evidence, of data. And so what are they telling us? Okay, let's go. Well, first thing we're going to look at is this question of junk DNA. You ever heard of junk DNA? Is that evidence for evolution? Okay, let's talk about what we mean by that. If we let this diagram here represent all of the DNA in each of our cells, we call that the human genome, all of our DNA. And in every cell, we have a couple of meters or more of this stuff, of DNA. And interestingly enough, of all that DNA in every one of our cells, only 2% has DNA codes for making protein. Now, we call this coding DNA. What we mean by that is coding for protein means it gives the instructions for making a specific protein. So all the proteins have instructions here on how to make them. That's the coding DNA. But that's only 2% of our DNA. Most of it didn't seem to be doing anything. And it's been believed to be junk DNA. In other words, just leftovers from the evolution process, just junk. And this is very important actually to the evolution theory, because this junk is believed to be the place where you have all these genes that are not doing anything that can mutate and gradually become a new gene to make something new, some new protein. I remember in the early 1970s, some of my colleagues at Loma Linda, molecular biologists, predicting that we'll find that it's not junk DNA, because we believe God doesn't make junk. But it wasn't there wasn't evidence for that for a long time. But finally, in the last decade or two, there have been articles appearing periodically that raise questions about this junk DNA. This one I liked. It's the junk that makes us human. Nature is the most prestigious scientific research journal in the world. Okay, here was this article. Could it be the non-coding DNA, that is the junk DNA, that makes us human? Now, what does that mean? There are these articles that would appear that seem to say that the non-coding junk DNA is actually the control mechanism. That's the control DNA that the engineer is using to tell the other DNA what proteins to make and when. Okay, just because you can make proteins, you have to know that's not enough. You have to know when and where and how much to make of each one. If you had an automobile factory with lots of machines to make pistons and bolts and all the rest, and that's all you had, pretty soon you just have piles of bolts and piles of pistons, and you have to have a massive control system to tell all these machines when to do their thing. And that seems to be what this supposed junk DNA is. Next. And finally, in September of 2012, again in the journal Nature, the results of a massive research project were published. This was only part of the publications. There were like 30 articles published at once. The results of a massive government-supported research project looking at every part of the human genome to try to see what it might be doing. And they found that indeed it's not junk. There's no junk, or at least maybe almost no junk. It all is this control mechanism that's telling the coding genes when to make their protein. Okay, so that's a blow to evolution theory, because they need that junk DNA, and it just isn't fitting their theory. On the second one now, I have to give you a little bit of background first. In evolution, a new structure or gene cannot just appear. Okay, if there was no creator, it would have to be possible to trace the steps in the evolution of every gene, of every protein, of every structure we have. How did we come to have the kind of brains we have? How did we come to have a warm-blooded nature? Well, all those things, if life came about by evolution, you'd have to be able to trace the development of every one of these things in gradual, small steps, if it's even possible at all. But it could not happen all of a sudden. Okay, but with this new ways of analyzing DNA now, they recognize something else called orphan genes. And that's an important concept. Here we have this, again, this evolutionary tree. And like I was saying, everything new that is going to appear in the process of evolution would have to be able to be traced back. It would have to come about by small steps, one at a time. So butterflies, okay, not yet for this slide. Butterflies, they got wings, okay, their ancestors don't have wings. Their presumed ancestors don't have wings. The wings could not just, bam, appear. They'd have to gradually evolve. We would have to be able to trace the wing genes gradually back and see how they started to evolve. They could not just appear. But now comes the discovery of orphan genes. Okay, next slide. Okay, the OG represents the orphan genes. Now, actually, they're in every creature, not just these. But the butterfly here, it has these genes. They're called orphan genes because there are no similar genes in other organisms that you could trace their evolution from. There is no evidence of how these orphan genes came to be. How did butterflies have genes for wings? Well, they just appeared. Honeybees, they have some genes that give them the ability to make honey. Okay, you cannot find similar genes in other insects that these could have evolved from. The honeybee genes just appear, as if somebody knew the honeybee was going to need them and gave them these genes. I mean, you know, that's reasonable, right? And these are not just a few here and there. They are everywhere, orphan genes, and that's just being realized in recent years, just the last few years. Maybe even 20% or more of all the genes are actually orphan genes. Each creature has the genes that certain genes that they need, that the Creator gave them. We have about 1,000 orphan genes. At least humans have at least 1,000 orphan genes, just unique genes that we have, that chimpanzees don't have, no other creatures that evolutionists think of as being our ancestors. They don't have these orphan genes. One of them that's been studied is the gene that gives us such a big brain. Okay, that's kind of important for us. So orphan genes are a serious problem now for the evolution theory. The next one is a very fascinating topic, epigenetics. Epigenetics, next. Okay, it's recognized now that DNA by itself can do nothing. We used to think that DNA is what controls the organism. It makes everything. Well, now it's recognized, no, DNA is I mean, it's wonderful. You have to have it, but it's just a big, massive amount of information, like a computer hard drive. It's full of information, but your hard drive won't do anything by itself. DNA will not do anything by itself. There are levels of control that interpret the DNA, that tell the DNA what to do and when, that turn genes on and off, that control exactly what the DNA is doing. These new levels of control are just been realized in recent years. Our DNA has hundreds, actually thousands, maybe millions of little chemical molecules, little markers on the genes. They methyl groups and other things, but anyway, these little markers turn the genes on and off or control how they function, and these are part of the control system, and this is the epigenetic system. And the interesting thing is that we want to discuss here is that these instructions in these other levels of control, they are affected by the environment in amazing ways. For instance, if a lady is pregnant, she's going to have a baby, and if she lives a very healthy life and she is in a comfortable position, she does not experiencing a lot of stress, that will affect her infant by these epigenetic processes that will put markers on the genes to turn the appropriate genes on or off. And those things are not just affecting her child, they will carry on for 2 or 3 or more generations. So this is a totally a new concept that's being understood now, that there are these genetic processes that control the genes, that turn the genes on and off, give instructions to the DNA, and these are affected by our environment, and the effects last for several generations. Books on epigenetics sometimes use Audrey Hepburn as an example. You know, the actress Audrey Hepburn. She was a petite, small, beautiful lady, had a lot of health problems. Okay, and these resulted from something that happened during the Second World War. The winter of 1944, the Germans were having a hard time and things were not going well, and the Dutch were not very helpful at all. They were not supportive of the Germans. And so the Germans blockaded the northern part of Netherlands for several months during that very hard winter. The people ran out of food. They didn't have enough of the food. People were living on like 30% of the nutrition they should have. They were eating tulip bulbs and shoe leather and whatever they could find. And Audrey Hepburn was a teenager during that time. Okay, and her health suffered from that the rest of her life. Now, when the war was over, why didn't she get better? Well, epigenetic processes had apparently affected these genes, turned genes on and off, so she remained unhealthy. And lots of other women, of course, were actually pregnant during this time, and the health records in Netherlands allowed following those children, those infants, to see what happened. And depending what part of the pregnancy came during that famine would affect what effects the babies had, lifelong effects, which actually carried on to the next generation. So how does this work? Well, and there's increasing evidence that these epigenetic processes are environmental effects that influence the genes, can carries on for several generations. Does this remind you of something in the Bible? Talks about the sins of the fathers being carried on to the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. I always wondered what that was all about. Well, it appears that the person who inspired the Bible knew about epigenetics and knew that this is what happens. The environment affects. This is an article published in this prestigious journal, Nature, and it had this picture. The title of the article was Epigenetics, the Sins of the Father. Okay, so this is, people who study this, even if they don't believe the Bible, they recognize this is what is happening now, that their epigenetic processes affect offspring for several generations, and it may be many generations in some cases, probably in a lot of cases. So, and this is a puzzle for evolution, because what's happening here is the environment is stimulating, it's causing changes, genetic changes, that are necessary, are beneficial to the organism. Now, we live in a dangerous and bad world, and some of these changes are not beneficial, but they're caused by the environment, and if the environment is good, the results are good. And if you don't have a creator, that can't be. Because if the environment is stimulating beneficial changes, which actually don't change the DNA, but they change how the DNA is being used. If you have these beneficial changes stimulated by the environment, it looks like somebody out there knows what the organism needs. You see? If you don't have a creator, all changes to organisms have to happen by random mutations. Random meaning the mutation process doesn't know what the organism needs. If somehow your system in your body knows what will be needed, it looks like there's somebody out there, that information is coming from somewhere. There's some intelligence that knows what is needed. Well, that can't be for an evolutionist. So epigenetics is a serious puzzle. And these things together really are a serious blow to the theory of evolution. Now, that can be an encouragement to us, but do we see that evolutionary scientists are questioning their theory now because of this? No, not at all. And why is that? I mean, this is a complete blow to evolution. We don't need to get there quite yet. So why are they not changing their mind about evolution? And that's a very important, the answer to that is a very important factor, and that is they don't believe in an atheistic system of evolution because of the evidence. It's because of an assumption. The assumption that there's no creator. And so, like I said, we all start with one or two assumptions that we accept on faith. And their assumption they accept on faith is that there is no creator. That's where they start. And so if they're really committed to that, these things are not going to change their mind. They'll just try to figure out how they can explain that somehow. All of us at some point in our life make a decision. Are we going to accept God and His Word, or are we not? And when I look at friends and I see which direction they go, in most cases they make a decision on that score, and then after that the evidence probably won't make much difference to them. I mean, they're interested in the evidence, but it won't change which direction they go in most cases. In some cases it does. A very famous atheist in Britain, Anthony Flew, he was a very outspoken atheist all during his career. He finally, from reading and studying about evidence for intelligent design, he changed his mind. Decided there is a God. And so people do change, but typically that doesn't happen. And most of these evolutionary scientists, bless their hearts, I mean, we'd like to see them accept our Creator and learn to love Him, but in most cases, these things don't change their mind. They've already decided there is no Creator. But there's another one here we need to talk about. Another problem that is coming, which is a result of these and other things. And a little background before we mention this. In evolution, all new genetic information, and we've talked about this already, but I need to emphasize it here. This all must arise by random mutations. Because if you don't have a creator, you don't have anybody who knows what's needed. And so the mutation process must be random and then controlled by natural selection. And random meaning the process cannot know what the organism needs. Next. Okay, but thinking scientists, even if they don't accept a creator, some of them are coming to recognize the cell is too sophisticated for random mutations. I have a book I really like. It's by an evolutionary scientist, a molecular biologist, but he's a very honest person, and he's not controlled by his assumptions as much as some others. And even though he doesn't accept the creator, he's recognizing, and he says very frankly in his book, exactly this: the cell is too sophisticated for random mutations. So the Darwinian process, Darwin's process of random mutations and natural selection causing everything to evolve, doesn't work. He still believes that somehow we evolved, but there must be some other way. He's recognizing the cell is just too sophisticated for this to work. The cell, it has this ability to evaluate what's happening in its environment and make decisions. He uses this term. It makes decisions, the cell makes decisions on how to interpret the DNA and how to use it, the information there. And the cell has repair mechanisms. If anything goes wrong, a gene is copied wrong, it has amazing abilities to correct that, far more than what used to be thought. So the cell is just so amazingly sophisticated. It kind of looks like maybe we have a creator who knows what was needed next. So I have a little analogy here to illustrate what I think is the difference between how scientists used to understand evolution and what the evidence is saying now. And this analogy comes from an automobile factory. So here you have a piston making machine. It's making pistons, and it has a Can't see this very clearly here, but there's a box here. That's the computer that controls it, tells it how to do its work. So it's spitting out pistons. And now you have maybe some lightning strikes this thing and makes a change in the instructions in your computer. That's similar to what is assumed to happen in evolution. Something makes a random change in the DNA. So you got a random mutation, and now it changes the instructions and it makes wider pistons. Okay, so something has happened, something has evolved. Over here you have a bolt machine, same thing happens. You have a strike of lightning, changes a bit of instructions in the machine. To me, that's trying to improve an organism by random mutations is kind of like taking a computer, stabbing a screwdriver into it to see if it'll improve it. But anyway, that's the theory, that these random mutations don't know what is needed, but they're just random. All right, now this scientist, James Shapiro, wrote that book I just told you about, he says it's more like what I'm describing here. He didn't, next picture, he didn't make this, I did, but the way he describes how sophisticated the cell is, this is how I'd compare it. If you take your automobile factory now, you don't have these little random mutations making changes. Instead, you've got this. You've got these sensors that are sensing what's happening in your engine rotation speed, temperature, stress, vibration, the fit of these pistons in the cylinder. The cell has all these sensors, and we know now that organisms the cells have these sensors. They detect their environment, what's happening, and they figure out what's needed. And so then that information goes to control modules, software in the cell. In our analogy here, that's affecting oil mixtures, piston lengths, widths, all these things. This information is being shared, and then it's being shared with stage 2 controllers, stage 3 controllers, which are all interacting with each other to figure out how to respond to these things that the sensors are seeing in their environment. And then there's a category, information, to tell what changes might be able to be made in the cell to meet these problems that are being sensed here. And then there's an error correction, a damage repair system. That's just amazing. And all of this is interacting with each other and with the master controller, which finally determines exactly what's needed. Okay, that's the kind of sophistication that is in every one of our cells in our bodies, which science is finally just understanding. Okay, next. Okay, and so this all being the case, if you do have a random mutation, you have a lightning strike on your computer, or you have a random change that happens in your cell, what's most likely going to happen? Well, here are the most likely results of random mutations. One, system failure. It doesn't work anymore, which often happens. Geneticists tell us, in fact, that the human genome is degrading because of mutations, degrading anywhere from 1% to 5% per generation. Why do we have so many people dying of cancer? Why do we have all these problems? That tells you a lot why. You have system failure, or reduced efficiency, or the mutation is simply eliminated by this error correction system. That's why this evolutionary scientist is saying Darwinian system of random mutations, changed by random mutations, doesn't work. There has to be some other way. And after going through all this, he says, no, so how did this system we have, how did it evolve? He just says, well, that's a mystery. We have no idea. And I agree with him. He also says, how did life come about? That's a mystery too. He's very honest, recognizing the problems he doesn't have answers for. Next slide. So, is the new evidence giving increased support to evolution? No, exactly the opposite. Every year of biochemistry research is making it a more serious problem for the theory of evolution. Next. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little parable. Elder Zinke is going to talk more about this concept, but I'm just going to give you a parable to illustrate something. Parable, of course, is a story which has a deeper meaning than the story itself. Okay, in this parable, you have a man who has dogs. He wants to raise dogs. He likes dogs, and he wants to raise a lot of dogs. Next, he has a problem. he has to deal with, there's this wolf in the neighborhood. And this is not your ordinary wolf. This is a very mean wolf. He will try to kill all these dogs. There will be great suffering and death and agony. So what's he going to do about that wolf? Well, this man decides that he will raise lots of puppies, and most of them will get slaughtered, murdered by the wolf, but a few of them, the strongest ones, will survive, and they will be indeed the strongest. So that's his answer. Next. We have another man who wants to raise dogs. He loves his dogs, and he has a little different approach to this. He loves his dogs, and he's a little smarter. Next, he has the same wolf to deal with. Next slide. He's got this same wolf to deal with, but he does it differently. He makes a fence around his property. He trains his dogs to stay in the fence. And one day he sees one of his little dogs wandering out of the fence. He sees him walking towards the wolf, towards the woods. The dog is going out, the wolf is coming. So what's he going to do? He could say, "You dumb dog, I taught you to stay in the fence." But he doesn't do that. He runs out and jumps between the dog and the wolf. He takes a terrible beating, but he saves his dog. I have a nephew who I think is a true hero. His name is Darren. He has three siblings, 2 younger sisters and a younger brother. And when Darren was 11 years old, the kids were out playing in the yard. The mother was off another part of the yard. The neighbors had a big dog, a very mean dog. And this day that dog got out of its fence, and it came and he jumped over their fence, and it came running for one of the little girls. He could have killed that little girl. He was a big dog and she was a little girl. Darren instinctively jumped between the dog and his sister. And he took some nasty bites on his arm and his shoulder before his mother was able to get there. But he saved his sister. Next. Okay, so what does the parable mean? Well, we'll take the first one. Next slide. We'll talk about this one first. This man, this represents the situation where God creates Adam and Eve. The earth is good. Next. Adam and Eve sin, that brings pain and evil and death. And you have the wolf in the neighborhood. Jesus accepted torture and death to save humans. He jumped between us and the wolf. That's the integrated Christian worldview. Next. The other one represents the story where God creates by allowing life to evolve. Next. And the evolution, of course, is survival of the fittest. So if evolution was God's method of creation, then he's doing all this by survival of the fittest. Next. Which survival of the fittest, that means lots of pain and suffering and death. Evolution is all about death. You have to have death of innumerable generations to have evolution. And if that's God's plan, then God made this. That's theistic evolution. Next. Okay, so, but we can ask, how do theistic evolutionists explain the origin of evil, suffering, and death? Okay. I've read 3 explanations they give. One that, well, God really isn't good, he doesn't care. Or maybe he's good, but he's not able to create except through evolution. That's the best he can do. The third one, God doesn't know the future, so he didn't know that all the evil that evolution would bring. I know of one Seventh-day Adventist. Here, I would summarize those by saying either God is cruel, he isn't all-powerful, or he's not very smart. And of course, those are all tragic caricatures of the God of the Bible. Next. But there's a fourth explanation, of course, you're all familiar with the great controversy. Satan rebels, God creates peaceful, sinless world. Sin brings evil, and Jesus on the cross, and evil is finally destroyed. This is the only one that makes sense, of course. Next. Now, most Christians are not going to fall for this one. So they're not going to jump from here to here. So the devil knew you needed something more clever. So he came up with this one in between, theistic evolution. That it looks like it's kind of biblical. You got God involved. But it really is not the same as creation. And so this is why this is a very important choice. Next. This isn't coming out quite right, but science, in our culture today, it's proposed that there's a two-level understanding of truth, in quotes. Religion has personal subjective values and emotions. So the world of the heart, that's religion. We base our beliefs on assumptions. Scientific knowledge is public, neutral, objective, reliable facts. The world of the mind. And it's based on facts. Well, is this true? No, of course not. Religion and science both involve all of these things. And there is not this difference of assumptions and facts. We all start with some assumptions. We look for evidence to understand those assumptions. And the world of the mind and the world of the heart all has to work together for scientists and for religionists, for everybody. Next. And so we have these two worldviews, the Christian worldview and the Darwinian worldview, matter and energy, purposeless origin, mutation and natural selection, evolution of all creatures, progress. Well, are we really progressing? I'm not sure that we are. And then annihilation. Next. And this is, of course, the literal creation compared to theistic evolution. Next. I want to look here quickly at some issues in history. Creation and the final, history and the future. Creation and the final conflict. Some important things happen in October 1844 that we're all familiar with. End-time prophecies in Daniel and Revelation talk about something that we refer to as the time of the end. There are dates that are given for the beginning of this time period. And 1798, 1844 are important parts of this. So what happened in 1844? Well, that we understand is beginning of this, the important part here of the time of the end for us. God is in the most holy place. It's the end time judgment. But some other things happened in October 1844. At that time, Charles Darwin wrote an abstract of his theory. He didn't publish it at that time, but he wrote it. And also another book was published in October 1844, Vestiges of the Natural History of the Creation by Robert Chambers. Now this was a totally evolutionary understanding of nature. He didn't have an evolution theory like Darwin did, but this book is credited as being the most important factor in preparing the way for acceptance of Darwin's theory. Okay, so this happened in October 1844. The devil is beginning his counterattack. He knows what's happening, and he knows that he's losing. He's a poor loser, but he's determined to take as many of us down with him as he can. Next. And our last day instructions, we get to Revelation 14. The three angels worship the God who made the heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. God is calling us back to worship the Creator at this very time when everybody is going the other way. So many people are going the other way. Next. Does creation matter? Absolutely, it does. It's a very important thing, and Elder Zinke is going to give you more information on this. Next. So now we have happening in the world what I would call the Great Divide. The church, the body of Christ, is going these two ways. To human reasoning, science is our standard, theistic evolution. Where would the Sabbath fit in this? Well, it's not clear. On the other side, you have trust in God. The Bible is our standard, a literal creation, and the seventh-day Sabbath. And so this is the Great Divide, which is already happening, and I think is going to progress more and more. Next. Okay, but I want to finish with some thoughts on what we do with this. The gospel and relationships. How are we going to relate to other people on these issues? On people who disagree with us, who want to explain everything by evolution, who don't accept the Bible? Do we just argue with them? Is that the right approach? I had a graduate student some years ago. He just came to Loma Linda, and he was asking me, what are the best issues that you can win an argument on evolution? And I said, none. You're taking the wrong approach. You've got the wrong attitude. You need to first of all become their friend. You become somebody's friend, and if they've sense you as a friend, and then they start asking questions, then you need to be ready to answer their questions. We don't win people by putting them down and making them look foolish. One objection I have to what the Review and Herald did, they published this article by Dr. Chadwick and myself, and I think it was a good article, but they published with it a picture of this empty-headed man with his brain kind of falling apart. Well, we've gotten into a bad habit of doing this kind of thing, making fun of people who don't accept evolution. Is that going to win them? Can you imagine Jesus doing that? No, never. We need to approach them in friendship and love and try to win them. This is a beautiful spot out here in northern Arizona. This is a friend, geologist. He's an atheist. He and I did research years ago on a geological formation in northern Arizona, the Coconino Sandstone, and I studied some evidence in it that he disagreed with. Most scientists see this sandstone as having formed by wind-blown sand in a desert. Well, I wondered, is that consistent with the flood, or is it, we don't know what happened. And maybe there were times when there was high winds and the water went down during the flood. But it seemed like we need to look at some other possibilities for this. And I found evidence that in fact, can only be explained if this was all happening underwater. Well, this gentleman and I argued in the scientific literature over this. I was able to answer his arguments fairly well, I think, but we became friends. And I brought him to Loma Linda once to give a seminar on his research, and we took him to a museum in LA, a couple of us. And on the way back, he started asking questions. He says, I know there's something different about how you approach faith and science. I'd like to know what it is. So we got into a very frank discussion about how we use the Bible to give us ideas about geology, and I'm going to talk about some of those this afternoon. And so he understood very well how we approach this, and we left as friends. And later on, I emailed him and I said, would you like to meet me in Arizona and spend a few days looking at the rocks and fossils together? And yeah, he did. So we did that. So we spent several days in northern Arizona looking at the rocks. He couldn't find the evidence in my formation that he was looking for to try to say this was formed by wind. But we spent hours sitting under a juniper tree talking philosophy and religion, with him asking the questions. And we had come to trust each other as scientists, and this trust carried over, and he asked me questions that I'm sure he would never ask a pastor. Like, what is salvation? What is heaven? What is hell? And we talked about these things for hours. And he was honestly wanting to understand how we view all of this. And I remember the last day, we were really done with what we were doing. I could have driven home that afternoon, but he wanted to stay and camp another night. He was eager to do that. He offered to pay for the camping site. So we stayed. And we talked again all evening. And after all this wonderful conversation with a delightful atheist, I remember as I crawled in my sleeping bag, my prayer was, God, please, no more. I can't take any more blessings in one day. And so we need to be friends with them and try to win them. We did research in Peru for about 10 years on fossil whales. I'll tell a little bit about that this afternoon. We worked with a paleontologist, Mario. He has no religious background. We always hired him to work with us. And he had no religious background, but he would politely listen to our devotional times we spend with our students. He helped us cook vegetarian food and became a dear friend. And he started asking questions. And like I said, he had no religious background, but the way he lived his life, the way he was so anxious to help the poor people in those communities there, he reminded me of what the Bible says, what Jesus said, if you've done it to one of the least of my brothers, you've done it to me. And I told him that. Anyway, this is a long story. I can't go into it all, but But I remember an email I got from him a year or so ago. He said, "It's been an honor to have known you in this life." Yeah, what's that mean? He's thinking. And since then, it's clear he has been thinking, and he really, it appears, has accepted God and has turned his life in a different direction. So, thank you this morning. Okay, we'll close with a prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this time to talk about you, our wonderful Creator, and try to understand better how to help others and how to have confidence ourselves in the wonderful, correct word you've given us on origins. And we thank you for all these things in your name. Amen.